Today I want to talk about something not quite as interesting as live view HD from space, or why HDR TVs could really be more accurate just by calibrating to themselves. But I would like to talk a little bit about a problem, and that problem is that we're starting to outstrip the capabilities of getting signals into displays. This has been a problem ever since the first UHD TVs came to market. So let me lead you off with my concept. Audio?
Just brushed it. We're good.
The people at Fulton Bank are still wondering who that knucklehead was that was driving back and forth in a Mazda Miata videotaping their speed bumps. But it's an appropriate analogy. We do have some real speed bumps, and by that I mean that we are going to be creating signals that we want to drive a display that are simply too fast for the interface going into the display. And we have workarounds for getting by that, but they involve kludges like 2 or 4 display interfaces at a time, or reducing the color resolution or reducing the frame rate. So I thought I'd have some fun with this, and my goal here isn't necessarily to pick on anybody, but my goal is maybe we really need to rethink the whole display interface thing going forward, because we're going to be approaching some really, really fast speeds very, very shortly. And maybe it's time to just say, okay, this is what the interface needs to do, this is the speed it needs to travel at, and a lot of that may mean moving to things like optical fiber. So it really is a 21st century problem. It wasn't a headache until recently. Back in 1990, the most common display resolution was XGA, about a 50 megahertz pixel clock. 1990, broadcast TV was still 525 lines, okay, around a 30 megahertz pixel clock if you went progressive with 480. By 2000, we started to see the first widescreen displays with higher resolution coming out, so pixel clocks edged up to 74, 75 megahertz. And then we had a new interface come out, the first digital interface, DVI, which had a maximum pixel clock of 330 megahertz using dual link. And then HDMI appeared not long after to embed audio and make it a little bit more consumer friendly, retain that same maximum pixel clock, 330 megahertz. Not particularly difficult to do with the chipsets that were available. But then we stepped on the gas. So until 2012, the maximum everyday resolutions that we were seeing, and they weren't even that common, were 1080p 60 with a pixel clock of 148.5 and wide UXGA. And this was pretty exotic stuff. High brightness projectors, really high powered laptops, pixel clock around 160 megahertz. But those could still be both accommodated by single link and dual link DVI. Not a problem, and HDMI. Color bit depth, 9 times out of 10, it was 8 bits per pixel. That's pretty standard. The total data rates, less than 5 gigabits a second. And for HDMI 1.3.1.4 when it came out, 1.4 being the 3D version of 8.1.3, they kicked it up to 10.2 gigabits. We figured, we're safe. We're good for a long time. How can we possibly run faster than that? And at the same time, DisplayPort, which was introduced in 2006, was upgraded 2009 to version 1.2, 21.6. Well, I mean, that's, who's ever going to hit that speed? And then this happened, Ultra HD TV. It arrived in 2012. We have bigger screens with 4 times the number of pixels, and our pixel clocks took off like a rocket. All of a sudden now, we're talking about 2160p 30, 297 megahertz, 2160p 60, 594 megahertz, and 10-bit color with HDR. 10-bit addressable displays were starting to come into production. And now we're talking about some real hefty signal rates. So if we want to do something off a video card, let's say we're doing a gaming or virtual reality application, 2160, 8-bit 444, 17.28 gigabits. 2160, 10-bit 444, 21.4. Well, now we only have one interface that's fast enough to handle that. So the display signals very quickly got faster than their interfaces. How the heck did that happen? That's the same thing as me remembering carrying my little son around when he was about 5 or 6 years old, and now he's 6'2" and looking down at me. How the heck did that happen? He got taller than his father. So we tried to keep up. So HDMI version 2 was announced in December 2013 with a maximum clock of 18 gigabits a second. By the way, researching this a little sidebar, there's actually a college campus where the speed limit is 18 miles an hour. Anybody know what it is? University of Mississippi. Why is it 18? Because Archie Manning's uniform number was 18. I kid you not, you can look it up. So 18 gigs, including overhead, including the 8-bit, 10-bit formatting. So that could handle 2160 8-bit 444, 2160 10-bit 422, or 2160p 10-bit 420. But we created a speed bump. So if we want to do 2160p 60, 10-bit 444 can't get through. So there's our first speed bump. And it's not unreasonable. 10-bit RGB 444, we may want to create a signal like that. So, and then simultaneously, the Consumer Technology Association, formerly the Consumer Electronics Association, in specification 861, tried to standardize to keep down the cost of televisions on one clock rate and use multiples of it. So the base rate they chose was 74.25. So for 1287 60, that uses it. That's about 8-bit 420, 1.1 gigs, 1080p 2.23, 2160p 4.46. At 24 hertz or 30 hertz, they make the blanking interval larger at 24 hertz to keep the clock rate the same. And for the maximum speed, 2160p 60, 17.82 with 8-bit 420 color, or 444 rather. So that's great. But again, if I want to do 10-bit, I'm out of luck. I cannot get that through the interface. And then this happened, okay? Talk about a 1-2 punch. The HDR TV started to show up. And hand in hand with HDR, of course, wide color gamut. The two go together like soup and sandwich. So, whoa, Nelly, these require 10-bit. You really can't get away with using 8-bit. So we use 10-bit 420. We really should be using 10-bit 422 or 10-bit 444. So it may originate, and again, television, 420 for Blu-ray, 420 for streaming and everything. I'm talking about people that are generating something on a computer. It might come out in the 444 format. So if you add in UHD resolution with HDR of a bucket full of bits, that's where that 21.4 gigabits a second number came from. 594 megahertz clock times RGB, 10 plus 2, because it's the additional 2 bits of overhead, so you're at 21.4. HDMI 2.0 cannot transport this signal. We're at the University of Mississippi. We can only go 18. And DisplayPort is barely fast enough to do it, but if I want to kick that up to 12 bits, I'm stuck again, because my maximum speed limit is 22. So, DisplayPort announced version 1.3 in September of 2014. Now they kicked the speed limit up to 32.4. So that seems awfully slow, doesn't it? Especially if you're like me. I was just in Kauai, and they have 4-lane highways that are divided, but the speed limit is 35 miles an hour. So now I know exactly what it feels like to be a 10-bit 444 2160p signal. I can't get up to speed. So that will handle up to 2160. It'll actually do 16-bit 444. But TV manufacturers don't want to use it. You talk to them, they say, nah, that's a computer interface. You know, we don't want to put that on a television. We're going to use HDMI. So that's a bit of a problem. And then this happened, okay? It seems like as fast as we try to make up ground with where things are going as far as clock rates, the display manufacturers are like, ha, 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 I just stuffed more pixels in the TV. So here we have an LG Display 25-inch 5K LCD monitor, a Samsung super wide HDR LCD display, and now we're starting to see 8K monitors coming. And I want to see which monitor you pick when you do 8K live from the space station, because this is a problem you're going to run into. Do you remember anybody was at NAB, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, and they did live 8K, NHK did it? 32 HDSDI links just to get the signal from Planet Hollywood down to the convention center. It's a lot of optical fiber. So these are all native 10-bit displays. They go beyond UHD resolution, which means they want more speed. They don't want to see speed bumps. So there's some workarounds for this. The easiest one on the early UHD TVs, and I would love to find somebody that bought one of these back in 2012 when they were anywhere from $18,000 to $25,000, and don't support HDR, by the way. They probably don't want to admit that they bought it, but 4 HDMI inputs to stitch together some special video card, 2160p image from 4 1920 by 1080 quadrants. That's the workaround. That's a kludge. Okay, it was the early days, you had to do it, but we shouldn't have to put up with that nowadays. Or they simply scaled up a single 1920 by 1080 image, which is what I suspect most people were doing in the first place. Later models incorporated one or two HDMI 2.0 inputs, since they're faster, to interface the content, like UHD Blu-ray. And then there were super wide and UHD plus computer monitors that used two DisplayPort interfaces to stitch together images and achieve the target resolution. That 5K monitor I showed you a little while ago uses two 2560 by 1440 inputs, stitches the frames together to give you a full 5120 by 2880 image. If you're doing 8K, you've got to have four HDMI 2.0 or DisplayPort 1.2 inputs. Well, this makes things kind of complex and expensive. Right now, these are expensive monitors. They're not particularly cheap, but at some point, their prices will drop just like everybody else's prices, and you have to economize somewhere. So what I'm saying is it's really time for interfaces to step on the accelerator and not be so obsessed with backward compatible and being able to support everything we did before, but to say, no, we really need something that is truly future-proof. It's not just 3 years future-proof or 2 years future-proof or 5 years future-proof, because as you can see, the TV manufacturers and the panel manufacturers are running like 100 miles an hour, and they're going to keep bringing these products to market. These super wide monitors that have high resolution, they're just spectacular. You put 3 or 4 of them together, 5 of them together, and you have a great virtual reality experience. It's better than anything you can put on your head. Doesn't require any eyewear, but they do suck up a lot of pixels. So can we future-proof them? Just how fast do we really need them to be? What's technically feasible to achieve now? Those are all really good questions, and I don't have pat answers for them. It would be like saying, how high is up? You know, it could be that 10 years from now, 8K with 12-bit color is going to be a routinely viewed experience. I don't know. I probably won't even be able to see it at that point. Who knows? My eyesight may be gone. So let's start with a base rate, 2160p, 60 hertz, 16p, 16-bit 444. Okay, that just makes it through DisplayPort version 1.3 and 1.4, 32 gigabits a second. Is that fast enough? Well, one of the ways we can get around that issue, VISA has proposed a narrower blanking interval for 4K. So they're talking about doing 4176 by 2222. Okay, that cuts your pixel clock down to 556, and it results in a data rate of about 30.6 gigabits a second. So that's one way to do it, make the blanking interval smaller. But then we have another thing that pops up, and every time I see high frame rate, I always think of Jim DeFilippis sitting in the back there, because he was asking me a few years ago, Pete, where can I buy a television that'll support 120 hertz? I said, you can't. What do you mean you can't? I said, you can't. They don't make it. The interface, HDMI, will not support it. Won't go that fast. That's a speed bump. So we have HDR, we have wide color gamut, but then when if you throw in high frame rate, I don't know if anybody here was at NAB and you saw the demos of high frame rate that NHK did. It's pretty awesome stuff. Auto racing, soccer matches, anything moving at high speed that's razor sharp. Well, if you go to 120 hertz, bingo, you just doubled your clock rate. So that's another thing we have to future-proof for. So if we do 2160p 120 with 10-bit 444 color, we're at 35 gigabits a second. Bingo, we just hit another speed bump. If we do the VISA blanking, 4K 120 with 10-bit RGB color, we're at 40,068. So maybe 40 gigabits a second is fast enough? I don't know. Should we shoot for 45 and use compression to get past that? Is that a solution? By the way, it's really a lot of fun putting speed limit signs together in Photoshop. I have all kinds of wacky speed limits that I came up with. So how do we get around that? Well, DisplayPort 1.4 was announced at CES. Physical data rate remains 8.1 per lane with 4 lanes. Add support for HDR and wide color gamut, support for 422 and 420. Those of you who use DisplayPort, version 1.3 did not support a lower color resolution. DisplayPort 1.4 does support that and also adds support for HDR, HDR metadata, and wide color gamuts. It's also compatible with display stream compression, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Native support for optical fiber. This is a key. It seems to me that the way we're going, at some point, we're just going to have to bite the bullet and make these interfaces optical interfaces. That essentially future-proofs them forever, at least long after I'm gone. And it's compatible with USB Type-C. Those of you who have the newer Macs, you may notice that there's a couple of USB Type-C ports on there, and one of them is actually running an alternate mode, so it functions as a display interface. HDMI announced this year at CES version 2.1. And 2.0 is still kind of slowly rolling out. but we're already up to 2.1. So they are using a signal format more like DisplayPort, not necessarily TMDS, but more like packets. So instead of using 3 discrete lanes and a separate clock, they're using 4 lanes of data with an embedded clock, and those 4 lanes are good for 12 gigabits a second. I don't know if they can actually do this or they pulled this number out of thin air, but that's their target. Another thing they did was they moved from an 8-bit, 10-bit coding, which is very, very common and results in 20% signal overhead, to a newer format, 16-bit, 18-bit coding, which reduces the overhead to 11%. And now they're claiming they could do a maximum data rate of 48 gigabits a second across all lanes. Is there silicon that can support that right now? No. So what they're really saying is this is our target. You know, you can't just buy into it and say, oh, well, HDMI 2.1 will be in here and I'm good, I can do 48 gigabits a second. No, it's going to be a while before we see an interface that fast. It is also compatible with USB Type-C. I don't know for a fact that it's compatible with display stream compression. I've heard that it is. So, but the main thing is it still doesn't support optical fiber. And this to me is a serious drawback. At this point, if we're talking speeds over 30 to 36 gigabits a second, we need to have native support to transport a signal over optical fiber. There's other ways to get around the speed bump problem. Maybe we put everything on a network. Okay? Well, that at least allows us to transport it from point A to point B. We can use light compression, motion JPEG, JPEG 2000, run it through a fast switch, 10 gig switch. We can take 4-to-1 compression on 2160, 10-bit 444, knock it down to 5.35. That's a piece of cake to get through a 10 gig switch. But we still have to decode it at the far end, and we still have to get back to a display interface format, and bingo, we're back into speed bump range. So one possibility is something called display stream compression. This might be the fix. It was introduced in 2014. It was developed by Visa. Dale Stalitska at Samsung is one of the key guys behind this. What it does is it uses a very low latency compression. It's entropy-based, maybe just a few picture lines, and it's able to knock down to 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1, and at CES this year they were demonstrating 4-to-1. And it is nice. I mean, it's really hard to see the effects of the compression. But that's critical. If you're talking about a capped data rate of 32, being able to get down to half of that, well, that puts you back down to 16. So that's now within HDMI 2.0 and within existing DisplayPort format. Hardent is one of the leading companies doing research on this. They're developing chipsets to do 4-to-1 compression. It is compatible with all the DisplayPort formats from 1.3 and 1.4, not with 2.0, but HDMI 2.1, which again looks more like a digital format than a TMDS format, maybe. So this could be another way to get around the speed bump problem. So the question is, where do we stand today? Just because a specification is out there doesn't mean it will be adopted by everyone. There is a fast interface out there. It's DisplayPort, but it's only on computers. And the TV manufacturers are pretty stubborn about not wanting to support anything other than HDMI because they've always had HDMI. Customers are used to HDMI, and they don't want to shift away from HDMI. So it's widely used in everything from televisions and monitors to broadcast gear to my Panasonic and my Nikon digital cameras. Pretty much anything that can generate a video image is going to have an HDMI port on there. It might be a micro, it might be mini, it might be full size. 2.0 is most popular with Ultra HD TVs. It's standard for Ultra HD Blu-ray, some consumer and commercial AV interfacing and switching hardware. So you're starting to see products come to market that will say 1 input, 4 output, HDMI distribution amp, or a matrix switcher that will switch to HDMI. They're very slowly adopting version 2.0. That's great if you're just switching, again, 420 color, but if you're trying to switch RGB and you want to have increased color bit depth, you're going to have a problem. 2.1, well, we just zoomed from 18 to 48. I don't know if that's like bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, or we did it because we said we can do it, but the silicon isn't in production for it. This is still a long ways off. Version 1.2, which is very widely used on laptops, desktop video cards, Ultra HD monitors, signal extenders, and switchers. It's been out there a long time. 1.3 and 1.4, starting to appear on new laptops, very slowly being adopted by laptop manufacturers. And 1.4, That's HDR, wide color gamut. The specification is out there, but who's adopting it? Nobody, as far as I know. So where do we go from here? We can do 32 gigabits a second uncompressed across a copper interface. We know that. We can probably do 40 gigabits a second. There was another interface out there briefly, you might have heard of it, called Super MHL. Super MHL was developed by the same company that has all the intellectual property for HDMI. It was silicon image, it's now lattice semiconductor. It was a symmetrical interface, didn't matter which way you plugged the cable in, 36 gigabits a second uncompressed. Sounded great. Nobody wanted to use it. You know, and again, this is the same company that sells HDMI. There was zero interest in it, so it kind of went away. But it was certainly fast enough. So we know we can get to 36 with copper. So at what point do we move to 100% optical display interfaces and ditch the copper altogether? I think that's really a key component now of future-proofing the display interface, so we don't have to think about it anymore, so I don't have to come here and make these presentations anymore, and we can focus on more important stuff. And at what point do we adopt low latency display signal compression? The technology is out there. It works. It works really well. If you're at CES, I'm going to try to talk Visa into going to NAB this year, but if you're at CES, make it a point to go to the DisplayPort booth and have them show you the demos of 3-to-1 and 4-to-1 display stream compression. And can we get rid of speed bumps once and for all? Really, we'd stop worrying about this. Because 5K displays, there are 6K displays in the works, there's 8K displays in the works. We can make displays any shape, any size we want. We can stuff as many pixels in there as humanly possible. And we're certainly not going to be wanting to run 8-bit color into an 8K display. We're going to run 10-bit color, maybe 12-bit color into it. So we do have a real problem here. So can we get to 100 miles an hour and solve this problem once and for all? After all, why put up with this when you can have this? And that concludes my presentation. Mr. Symes, right on schedule.
Thank you, Pete. It's always fascinating. But I have to ask the dumbest of questions. You talk about various things and receiver manufacturers not wanting to do computer interfaces and things like this. In a home TV receiver, anything we're going to display probably arrived in a form that was 100 megabits or less, almost certainly a hell of a lot less than 100 megabits. Why are we going to all the trouble to turn it into 40 or 60 gigabits to throw it over an expensive interface into a device that probably has a decoder anyway?
Well, that is a very good question. My own personal philosophy on this is I don't want the display to be the limiting factor, and I certainly don't want the display interface to be the limiting factor, because whereas the average person at home may be very content watching 265 encoded Ultra HD with HDR, streaming at, I don't know, 100 megabits a second off a Blu-ray disc with 420 color, they might be very happy with that, but then there's somebody next door who's doing virtual reality, who's doing gaming, and is, seriously building their own system, and they're running off a video card with RGB, and they want to use that same television, and they get very frustrated by saying, I can't find a display that can output the signal that I want to drive into it. So for every person, and granted, that's most people who just want to watch television, they're not really going to nitpick it, there are going to be people out there that want the faster data rates, that want to be able to do, for one reason, souped up color, higher frame rates, just a better overall quality signal. So I leave it to the TV manufacturers and the Tyler Pruitts of the world to figure out how to make that look good. But what I'm saying is that the connection between the two should not be the weak link. It shouldn't be the limiting factor that slows anything down. Yes?
Paul Steckley, Applied Electronics, SMPTE Finance VP. Isn't HDCP one of the big culprits here? Isn't that the resistance moving away from HDMI? It seems to be the bane of the AV business these days.
HDCP stands for High Bandwidth Digital Copy Protection. It is supported by DisplayPort, by the way. It has been supported by DisplayPort since 2009. So that's not the obstacle at all. The obstacle is, again, just the physical interface and the resolution, color format, and the refresh rate that you're trying to shove through it. But no, HDCP doesn't really enter into this at all. Next question.
Yeah, by the way, I'm not sure fiber optics gets you very much, because even with 10 gigabit, 25, 50 gigabit Ethernet interfaces, the copper interfaces are still a lot cheaper than any of the fiber SFPs. So I think, if you're going to electric to optics, back to electric, if it's a short run, you have a thick cable, you can do the electric.
Well, I was thinking mainly multi-mode versus single mode.
Well, but that's more money. Yeah. But anyway, I want to talk about JPEG XS though. I think the display stream compression was developed for static displays, something you might have on your computer. But obviously the JPEG XS effort is to try to create a standardized mezzanine codec of the low latency of kind of the modern era, going beyond what we have with JPEG 2000. I'm curious if you've heard any feedback about JPEG XS.
I have not. I did sit in on the seminar, and you're right. That would actually be one workaround for it. But it seems almost inevitable at this point that the solution is to apply light compression to the signal transporting through the display interface, because if you look at the entire signal chain from a camera capturing the image all the way to the display, that's the only part of the chain that is still not compressed. And the question is, why not? It can be done. It could be done in the content being delivered to it, but why not do it right at the interface level? The hardened images, by the way, they do show both motion images and they both with static images. And it does a pretty good job. It's light compression. You really can't use it for much more than 2 to 3 to 1 compression. But for motion, that 2 to 1, cutting a bit rate in half, it solves a lot of problems. It buys you a lot in terms of being able to use an existing interface to get something into a display. But yeah, that's a valid solution. Yes?
Hey, John Maisels. Another practical question. So, and showing my colours, we still do our distribution at home on analog component.
Yep.
There's life in the old thing yet. But a lot of domestic consumers are going to be choosing one of 2 ways to connect the decoder box to the TV. They're either going to feed everything into the TV and use the TV as the switching device, which will work with the topologies you're talking about, or they're coming through an amplifier and using the amplifier as a switching device. So none of that applies, what you've just said applies to somebody who's using the amplifier as the switching device, unless the amplifier is also capable of those bit rates. What are you seeing as a transition or deliverable from the manufacturers there?
HDMI 2.0. You're talking about AV receivers.
Yeah. AV receiver.
Yeah,
anything which isn't the TV that's doing the switching.
Yes. They're supporting HDMI 2.0. That's where they're migrating to right now, because they don't really see a need to go beyond that. As I said early on, I don't necessarily have all the answers here. I just want to point out that we have this problem with the interface rate climbing up, and we seem to be kind of like patchworking, scotch taping, and duct taping a solution to it every time that it happens. Maybe it's time for a little bit more rational approach to it. I don't know that we can just say there's one interface and we use it for everything. I don't know if we ever get to that point. Is compression the solution? Do we have to compromise on the signal just to get it through the interface, or can we say, look, I want to do 4K 120, 444, 10-bit for virtual reality. Why should the display interface slow me down? That's not likely to be running through an AV receiver. That's likely to be running from a computer graphics card directly to a specialized monitor setup. So we're still going to have a place for the HDMI 2.0s and the slower bit rates and everything, because that's content distribution. What I'm saying is that for some applications, we're going to need to move past that. We have to figure out a way to get past. This shouldn't be the bump. The display itself should be the limitation. Maybe it doesn't have enough pixels, doesn't have enough bit depth, doesn't have a sufficiently fast panel. That's another problem. But for the display manufacturers to come out with a panel and say, well, you really can't use the full capability of the panel unless you have 2 DisplayPort connections or 4 HDMI connections or something, it's just crazy. We shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to get it over one signal transport. So, all right, well, I want to thank everybody for coming out for our session today. I hope we've given you some food for thought.